A woman, ridiculed by the town for her appearance, steps out into the crowd before the most fearsome man in the mountains and utters 3 unexpected words. "Marry me." Laughter erupts. But the man doesn't laugh. He looks at her and nods. What made Garrick Hale, the man Blackridge didn't dare look directly in the eye, agree to the proposal of a woman the town called useless? Please like and comment the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has come, and stay until the end, because this is a story you won't forget. The morning Ilara Voss walked into the center of Blackridge's market square and asked Garrick Hale to marry her, she was wearing her dead mother's boots. Cracked at the left sole, a size too small, mud-caked from the 2-mile walk she'd made before sunrise because she hadn't wanted anyone to see her rehearsing what she planned to say. It didn't matter. They saw everything anyway. They always did. Blackridge was the kind of frontier settlement that had too much time on its hands and too little mercy in its heart. Wedged between the eastern face of the Crelmore Range and a river that flooded every 3rd spring, it was a town that had been almost abandoned so many times that the people who stayed had grown mean about it. The way anything grows mean when it survives things it probably shouldn't have. The buildings along the main road were built to last and nothing more. No paint. No charm. The church had lost its steeple in a windstorm 4 years prior, and nobody had fixed it. The general store smelled of old flour and something that might have been a dead animal inside one of the walls. The people matched the town, weathered, practical, suspicious of softness in any form. Ilara had been born here. That was her first disadvantage. The second was that she was large, broad-shouldered and wide-hipped in a way that the women of Blackridge, who prized smallness and efficiency in a wife the way they prized it in a wood stove, had decided early on was her defining characteristic. Not her hands, which were capable of almost anything. Not her memory, which was the kind that retained details the way good soil retains rain. Not her voice, which was low and even and rarely rose above what the moment required. No, what they saw was her body. And what they made of that was a verdict they'd handed down when she was 11 years old and never revisited. Too much of her, people said. Takes up more space than she's worth. Her father had been a decent man, a former surveyor who'd settled in Blackridge after her mother died and never quite found his footing again. He'd passed 3 winters ago from a lung infection that started as a cough and became something worse before either of them admitted it. He'd left Ilara the small house at the edge of the settlement, his surveying tools, a mule named Doris and a debt to Marcus Webb at the general store that she was still paying down in installments. After he died, there was a period, maybe 4 months, when Ilara believed things might get better. She was 24. She had the house. She had skills. She could sew, preserve food, handle accounts better than most men in town, and she'd learned enough of her father's surveying work to read a land map the way most people read a letter. She thought, in that quiet, hopeful way that people think things when they haven't yet been fully defeated, that perhaps the town would see her differently now that she was managing on her own. What she hadn't counted on was Martha Penfield. Martha Penfield was 51, twice widowed, and ran the town's only boarding house with the efficiency and warmth of a military tribunal. She was also the unofficial curator of Blackridge's social opinion. What Martha said about you became what everyone thought about you within 48 hours. As reliable as weather moving east off the mountains. And what Martha had decided about Ilara Voss, sometime around Ilara's 12th birthday, was that the girl was unfortunate, a word Martha used with a very specific weight, one that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with appearance. Martha's opinion had calcified over the years into something that the town treated as established fact, the way you treat the direction of a river or the height of a mountain, not something you question, just something that is. Ilara had grown up inside that opinion the way you grow up inside a house with low ceilings. Hunched, careful, always aware of the boundaries. By the time she was 27 and had been working the same difficult patch of garden behind her house for 3 years while managing the debt and the mule and the slow decay of the roof, by then the humiliations had become so routine she barely registered them individually anymore. It was more like weather. Some days worse than others, but always present. Tom Breckett, who ran the livery, called her the Voss Ox when he thought she couldn't hear him. She heard him. She'd heard him the first time and the 15th time, and she didn't correct him because correcting Tom Breckett had no outcome that served her. The young women her age, the ones who'd married at 19 and 20 and 21, the ones with narrow waists and husbands who smelled like cedar and worked reliable trades, they didn't speak to her at the market with cruelty exactly. They spoke to her with a particular brand of pity that was its own kind of violence, the sort where they asked how she was managing and listened to her answer with expressions that said they found her situation both sad and somewhat predictable. She managed, that was the honest answer. She managed because she had no other option, and because her father had raised her to put one foot in front of the other, even when the ground was bad. But that summer, the summer this story begins, the ground became very bad indeed. The drought started in late April and didn't break. By June, the river had dropped 2 feet. By July, the smaller creeks that fed the outlying farms had gone to trickle or stopped altogether. The garden behind Ilara's house, which she'd coaxed into something productive over 3 hard years, burned at the edges and then in the middle, and then was mostly dirt by August. Her potato crop failed entirely. The bean rows she'd babied through a difficult spring came up sparse and bitter. Doris the mule drank twice what she usually did and looked at Ilara with the defeated eyes of an animal that understood things were not going well. She wasn't alone in this. The whole settlement was suffering. But suffering isn't evenly distributed. It falls hardest on the people who were already closest to the edge, and Ilara was about as close to the edge as a person could stand without falling. She still owed Marcus Webb $42. Her roof had developed a second leak over the back room where she stored her preserved goods. She had enough flour to last maybe 6 weeks, a small reserve of dried beans, and the kind of savings that disappear in a single emergency. In early August, she sat at her kitchen table after supper. What passed for supper? A thin soup she'd made mostly from scraps and herbs. And she did the arithmetic, the kind you do when you already know the answer, but need to see it written down to accept it. She wrote the numbers with a pencil stub on the back of an old surveying page from her father's files. The numbers said, "By October, you will be in real trouble." She sat with that for a while. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like paper tearing. She wasn't someone who panicked easily. Her father had called it her steadiness, and he'd meant it as a compliment. Though sometimes she wondered if steadiness was just what people called it when a woman had no room for the luxury of falling apart. But sitting at that table, in that kitchen, with those numbers in front of her, she felt something close to panic, a cold, practical fear that she recognized as different from ordinary worry. This wasn't things might go wrong. This was things are going wrong and I don't have a way to stop it. She needed help. Real help, not the kind offered with pity or strings attached. She thought about her options. They were not numerous. She could approach Marcus Webb about extending her debt, but Marcus Webb had already extended it twice, and the third time he'd looked at her with an expression she didn't like, something proprietary in it, something that suggested the terms he'd want for a third extension weren't financial. She would rather sell the mule. She could try to find domestic work in one of the better-off households, but there were 3 women ahead of her seeking the same thing, and the households that might have taken her had made it clear through the efficient cruelty of avoidance that they preferred others. She could write to her father's sister in Missouri, but her father's sister had her own troubles, and Ilara hadn't written to her in 2 years, and pride is a difficult thing to swallow on a deadline. And then there was the other option. The one she'd been circling for 3 days without looking at directly. Marriage. Not for love. She wasn't naive enough to frame it that way. Not with some romantic notion of being saved. She'd watched too many women in Blackridge get married and trade one kind of difficulty for another. What she needed was a practical arrangement with someone who had land and resources enough that pooling what they both had would be better than struggling alone. Someone who wouldn't mind her plainness or her size because they had other things on their mind. Someone who needed what she could actually offer: competence, reliability, honest work. In a settlement of 50-odd families, there were not many candidates, and then she thought of Garrick Hale. Garrick Hale was not a man who inspired easy conversation. He came into Blackridge maybe 6 times a year to trade furs, buy supplies, and leave again before anyone could work up the nerve to speak to him about anything beyond the business at hand. He was somewhere in his late 30s, though the mountain life had aged him in ways that made the exact number hard to read. He was tall, not freakishly so, but tall enough that he had to mind door frames, with the particular leanness of a man who worked hard and ate only what he needed. His hair was dark with threads of grey at the temples. His face was angular and windburned, and wore at rest an expression that most people in Blackridge interpreted as hostility, and that Ilara, the handful of times she'd actually observed him carefully, thought might be something else. Something more like exhaustion, maybe, or indifference, which isn't the same thing. He had a homestead somewhere in the upper Krellmore Valley. No one was entirely certain where, because Garrick didn't invite questions about it, and the few men who'd tried to follow him had lost him within a mile. He trapped the mountain ridges in winter, grew what he could in the short growing season, and kept himself apart from the settlement in a way that people alternately respected and resented. The stories about him were, as small town stories always are, a mixture of fact and elaboration. People said he'd killed a man in a dispute over a trapline, though the details changed depending on who was telling it. They said he'd lived alone in the mountains for 12 years, which was probably closer to true. They said he was dangerous, which they said about anyone who didn't explain themselves to their satisfaction. What Ilara knew, what she'd observed with her own eyes and filed away in that careful memory of hers, was this. Garrick Hale was someone who had resources. He always had good furs to trade. He always bought quality supplies in quantity. His equipment, the few times she'd seen it up close, was well maintained and thoughtfully chosen. And he never cheated anyone. She'd watched him at the trading post enough times to know that. He paid what was agreed and took what he'd negotiated and walked away without complaint or negotiation. A man who had enough and was fair about it. That was more than she could say for most. She thought about him for 3 days. She thought about what it would mean to approach him, the sheer audacity of it, a woman like her walking up to a man like him with a proposal. She thought about what the town would say. She thought about the ways it could go wrong. He could refuse, obviously, and that would be humiliating, but she was so practiced at humiliation that she'd developed a kind of professional relationship with it. It wouldn't destroy her. She'd walk home and put one foot in front of the other and figure out another way. What she could not think of, after 3 days of trying, was a better option. So on a Thursday morning in early August, she put on her mother's boots and walked into town. She hadn't planned for it to happen in the market square. She'd intended to catch him at the trading post, privately, where the conversation could happen without an audience. But she arrived to find the post closed. Hayes, who ran it, had taken ill, and Garrick already in the square with a set of loaded pack mules, negotiating with 2 men she didn't recognize over a stack of late summer pelts. The square was busy. It was market day, what passed for market day in Black Ridge, which meant maybe 30 people gathered in the open space between the trading post and the general store, buying and selling what the summer had left them. The drought had made everyone anxious and short-tempered, and there was a prickly, aggrieved energy to the crowd that she felt the moment she stepped into it. She stood at the edge of the square for almost 10 minutes, watching Garrick finish his negotiation. He spoke little, the 2 men spoke more. Eventually, Garrick said something she couldn't hear. The men counted out coin, and the transaction was done. He began loading supplies onto his mules with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. He'd be gone in 20 minutes. Do it now, or go home, she told herself. Those are the options. She walked across the square. She was aware of people watching her. She usually was. She had that particular self-consciousness of someone who has been watched and discussed for long enough that the awareness never fully goes away. But she kept her eyes on Garrick and put one boot in front of the other and crossed the distance between them. He heard her coming, or sensed it. He turned before she spoke, with that alertness of a man accustomed to being alone in places where not being alert got you killed. He looked at her without expression. Up close, his eyes were a dark grey-green, the colour of river water in shade. He waited. She stopped a few feet from him. She'd rehearsed this in the dark of her kitchen, and it had sounded reasonable in the silence of her own head. Standing here with the sun and the crowd and those flat, watchful eyes, it sounded different. She said it anyway. My name is Ilara Voss. My father was the surveyor, Caleb Voss. I have a house on the east edge of town and 40 acres of decent land, most of it upslope from the river. I know how to keep accounts and preserve food and handle a map. I'm not asking you for anything you can't afford to give. I'm asking you to marry me. There was a beat of silence. Just a breath of it before someone nearby started laughing. It spread fast, the way fire spreads in dry grass. She heard Tom Brackett's voice somewhere behind her. Well, I'll be damned. The ox found herself a target. A woman laughed, high and sharp, and then other voices joined it, overlapping, and she stood in the middle of it the way she always had, absolutely still, face level, letting it happen the way you let weather happen because there's no other choice. Martha Penfield was there. Of course she was. She'd appeared at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered with the supernatural timing she always had for these moments, and she said loudly enough to be clearly intended for Ilara's ears, "Someone should tell that poor creature that proposing to a man doesn't work like ordering from a catalogue. He's not going to ship himself to her door." More laughter. Garrick Hale hadn't laughed. He hadn't moved. He'd stood through all of it, looking at her with that same steady expression. Not warm, not cold, not amused, not contemptuous, just looking. The way you look at a problem you're considering carefully before deciding whether it's actually a problem. Ilara held his gaze. It was the only dignified thing left available to her, so she did it without blinking. He said, "How much debt are you carrying?" The laughter quieted slightly, replaced by something more confused. She blinked once. $42 to the general store. Nothing else. You said 40 acres upslope.
43, technically. My father's surveying put it at 43 and a half. The deed says 40. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a reaction, but close to one. The roof? She almost said fine, but she didn't. She said, 2 leaks. 1 manageable, 1 less so. He was quiet for another few seconds. The crowd had gone genuinely still now, which almost never happened in Blackridge, and she was aware of 30 pairs of eyes fixed on this exchange with the baffled attention of people watching something they couldn't categorize. Garrick looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and tightened the strap on one of his mule's packs. A simple, routine motion like he was finishing a thought, and when he turned back he said, "Come with me." 2 words, flat and plain and without ceremony. The square erupted. He shut.
What happened next was not graceful. Alara had about 4 minutes to go home, collect what she could carry in the pack she used for market trips, and return to the square before Garrick Hale moved on without her. She knew instinctively, from what she couldn't have said, just some reading of his manner, that he'd said the thing once and wouldn't say it again and wouldn't wait past a reasonable window. He wasn't a man who made offers twice. She ran. She ran home in her dead mother's 2 small boots, and she threw into her pack the surveying tools, her father's folding knife, 2 changes of clothing, her mother's Goodwill blanket, the small tin box where she kept what money she had, and the deed to the 40 acres. She stood in the middle of her small house for exactly 3 seconds, looking at the room she'd grown up in, and she thought, this may be the worst decision I've ever made. Then she thought, the second worst was doing nothing. She went back. Garrick was still there, the mules loaded, watching the road east with the patience of a man who'd already decided and had no interest in second thoughts. When she came across the square with her pack on her shoulder, breathing hard, he looked at her once and then looked at the pack. Checking the weight and size of it, she realized the way you'd check a load before a trail. "Good," he said, and turned toward the mountain road. She fell in behind him. Behind her, she could hear Martha Penfield saying something to someone in a tone of barely contained outrage, and Tom Breckett had taken up his original commentary again with fresh material, and the square had broken into the particular kind of noise that a small town makes when it's been given enough gossip to sustain it for a month. None of it reached her. Or rather, it reached her because she wasn't deaf, but it landed differently than it usually did. Walking away from it had done something to the volume. She could hear it, but it wasn't pressing against her the way it always had before, that constant weight of other people's opinions sitting on her shoulders. Maybe because she was walking towards something instead of just standing still inside it. She didn't know yet what she was walking toward. She had her pack and her boots and 43.5 acres of drought-dry land that she'd just left behind. And ahead of her was the back of a man she'd spoken maybe 40 words to, heading up into mountains she'd never entered. But she was walking, and that, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, felt like the right direction. The road into the Krellmore Range began as a road and became a trail and then became something you followed by instinct and experience rather than any visible path. Alara had gone as far as the lower foothills twice in her life, once as a girl with her father who'd been surveying a boundary claim, and once 3 winters ago when she'd tried to track a fox that had been raiding her henhouse and lost her nerve at the tree line. Beyond the tree line, the mountain opened up in ways she wasn't prepared for. It wasn't the scale of it exactly, though the scale was significant. The ridges stacking behind each other into a grey-green distance that made the whole of Blackridge seem like a detail you'd miss if you blinked. It was more the quality of the silence. She'd thought of wilderness as loud, or at least as full of sound, wind and birds and water, and those things were there. But underneath them was a silence that was different from the silence of her house or the fields. It had depth to it. Weight. Like the mountain wasn't quiet so much as it was indifferent to whether you made noise or not. Garrick moved through it without ceremony. He had a route, clearly, one he'd travelled so many times it had become like walking through a room in his own house, automatic, unhurried, eyes forward with occasional glances to the sides that she gradually understood were scans. Not sightseeing, he was reading the terrain the way her father had read maps, taking inventory. He didn't speak, and for a while she didn't either, not because she was unwilling, but because the mountain seemed to require a period of adjustment before conversation made sense. She was breathing harder than she'd expected on the uphill sections, her pack weight finding her shoulders in new ways, her 2 small boots beginning their protest against the uneven ground. After maybe 2 hours, he stopped at a small creek crossing and let the mules drink. She stopped too and took a long drink from her own canteen and watched him check the packs with the same quiet efficiency he did everything. She said, "Are you going to tell me what I'm agreeing to?" He looked at her. "You made the proposal. I made a proposal. You made a decision. Those aren't the same thing. I should know what I walked into. He was quiet for a moment, which she was learning was not the same as not having an answer. He said, Homestead, Upper Valley, 2-day ride. I trap through winter, grow what I can in the short season. The land is good, but it's hard. You said you can handle accounts and maps. I can. I'll need that. I've been managing it alone. He paused, and she thought she saw something cross his face that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. Shit. It works better with two. It works better with two. Not a declaration, not a promise. A practical assessment. She respected it more for that. What else? She asked. Hard winters. Sometimes weeks without seeing anyone from the settlement. The nearest neighbor is 6 miles down the East Ridge and we don't get along. Why not? He moved a trapline boundary 3 years ago and lied about it. She nodded. All right. That doesn't bother you. The isolation or the neighbor? Either. She thought about it honestly. The isolation is unknown. I'll tell you when I've experienced it. The neighbor, I'll form my own opinion on when I meet him. He looked at her for a beat longer than usual. Then he said, Fair enough, and clicked to the mules and walked on. They made camp the first night in a clearing below the second ridge, where a shelf of rock formed a natural windbreak and a small spring emerged from the hillside. Garrick made a fire with the specific minimal efficiency of a man who considered unnecessary steps a form of waste. He had a camp kit so well organized it looked designed rather than accumulated, so each piece in its place, every action deliberate. Alara made the meal. He hadn't asked her to, and she hadn't announced she would. She'd simply taken stock of what was in the food pack while he tended the animals and put together something decent from what was there. Dried venison, hardtack softened in water, a small ration of dried beans that had been pre-cooked and preserved in salt. Not much, but enough, and put together properly rather than just heated and eaten. He sat across the fire from her and ate without comment, which she chose to take as a neutral sign rather than a negative one. After a while he said, Your father, the surveyor, he mapped the valley it approaches. She looked up. Some of them. He worked the eastern Krellmore boundaries about 15 years ago, before I was old enough to go with him. I have his notes. In that pack. Not the original journals. I didn't know where we were going, but I have his summary maps, the ones he made fair copies of. They're in the tin box. He was quiet again, then. Those maps would be useful. She almost said, I'll trade them for something, which was the instinct. Everything in Black Ridge was a trade. Every resource was leverage. You didn't give things away without knowing what you were getting back. But she stopped herself because she was not in Black Ridge anymore, and because something about the way he'd said it, without manipulation, without pressure, as a simple statement of fact, made her think that he was not playing a game she needed to guard against. She said, I'll show them to you when we arrive. He nodded. A log shifted in the fire and sent sparks upward, and they sat in the mountain dark. Two people who had agreed to something enormous without quite having a framework for it. And the silence was not exactly comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people still figuring out what kind of silence they were going to be allowed with each other. She wrapped herself in her mother's wool blanket and lay down on her side facing the fire and thought, I might be a complete fool. Then she thought, yes, but at least I'm a fool who's done something. She slept. Kishuk. The second day into the mountains was harder than the first in the way that second days often are. The novelty had worn off, and the body had started to register its complaints with more specificity. Her left foot, where the boot pinched worst, had raised a blister by mid-morning. The uphill sections in the afternoon were steeper than anything they'd covered the previous day, and the altitude had given her a mild headache that sat behind her eyes and pulsed when she breathed too hard. She didn't mention any of this, not because she was trying to perform toughness. She had no particular interest in impressing Garrick Hale on a trail, but because mentioning it wouldn't change it, and she'd found over the years that naming a discomfort aloud sometimes made it larger rather than smaller. At one point in the early afternoon, crossing a long switchback traverse on a south-facing slope, she lost her footing on loose shale and went down hard on one knee. She heard Garrick stop ahead of her. She heard the mules halt, and she was already getting up before he could turn around. She was on her feet by the time he'd looked back, hand braced on her knee, the torn-up patch of skin there already tightening in the dry air. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Shale's worse on this face, he said. Walk the inside edge where the ground's firmer. That was all. He turned and went on. She thought, as she followed, that this was either the most considerate or the least considerate thing a man had ever said to her in that situation, and she genuinely couldn't determine which. They arrived at the homestead in the late afternoon of the second day, and for a moment, Just a moment before she reassembled herself, Ilara stopped and stared. She'd expected something bleak. A rough structure in a clearing, functional and joyless, the kind of place a solitary man built to survive rather than to inhabit. And the homestead was definitely rough. The main cabin was a low, solid structure of notched logs, with a sod roof that had gone to grass along the edges and a porch that was more practical than architectural. There was a barn, smaller but well-built, and a root cellar dug into the north hillside with a heavy door. A kitchen garden, mostly gone now in the drought, the same as everything, sat behind the cabin with the evidence of previous seasons in its layout, proper raised beds, good soil management, and beyond all of it, opening behind the cabin like a held breath finally released, the valley. Long and wide and still, cupped between the arms of the upper ridges, with a creek threading through it that was reduced from drought but still running, which was more than the lowland creeks could say. Grass, some of it brown but much of it still green near the water. Trees, aspen and pine and something she didn't recognize, standing along the valley sides in arrangements that suggested they'd been growing there for a very long time. And beyond the far ridge, still holding snow on the highest faces even in August, the peaks of the Krellmore proper. She hadn't expected beauty. She hadn't prepared for it. It arrived without warning and did something to her chest that she couldn't name immediately and chose not to examine too closely. Garrick had stopped beside her, watching her look at it. "It's good land," she said. "Yes," he said. It was the first time they'd agreed on anything, and neither of them made anything of it. They did not have a wedding ceremony. There was no one to perform one, and Garrick showed no interest in organising one, and when Ilara thought about what she actually wanted, not what was expected, but what she actually wanted, she found she didn't particularly want the performance of it either. There was a Bible her father had left her in the pack, and she supposed that somewhere in Black Ridge's records there was a procedure for this, but they were not in Black Ridge, and the procedure would wait. What they had instead was a practical conversation that evening, sitting on the porch in the last of the light, about how things would work. Garrick talked about the trap lines, where they ran, when they were set, what the winter rhythm of the homestead looked like. She listened and asked questions where she had them, which was more questions than he seemed to expect. She had a good memory for spatial information, her father's legacy, and she was building a map in her head as he talked, overlaying what he described onto the terrain she'd seen on the way in. She talked about the accounts. He'd been keeping them in a rough ledger that she asked to see, and what she saw there was the record of a man who was competent in the mountains and approximate in numbers, not dishonest, just imprecise in the way of someone who'd never had to be precise because the consequences weren't immediate. There were margins here. She could see them, efficiencies that weren't being captured, trades that could be structured better. "I can improve this," she said, meaning the ledger. "That's why I said yes," he said. She looked up from the ledger. He was watching the valley in the failing light. "Is that the only reason?" she asked, because she needed to know the shape of what she was in. He thought about it. She appreciated that he actually thought about it instead of answering immediately. "No," he said. "You were honest. You came to me with real terms instead of pretending it was something it wasn't. That's rarer than you'd think." She turned that over. She said, "I'll be honest with you about what I don't know and when I'm wrong. I'll expect the same from you." "Fair," he said. "And if this doesn't work, we figure it out," he said, like adults. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense of that word. It was two people in difficult circumstances making a rational agreement with their eyes open, and there was something in that plainness that Ilara found more solid than any ceremony could have given her. She went inside and made supper from the stores while he put the mules up for the night. And when he came back, she had food on the table and the lamp lit, and they ate together in the first evening of whatever this was going to be. The weeks that followed were defined by work, which suited Ilara better than she expected. There was always something that needed doing. The leaks in the cabin roof, both more serious than Garrick had dealt with, required immediate attention before autumn, and Ilara turned out to have a more systematic approach to the repair than he did. He knew how to fix things. She knew how to look at the problem first and figure out why the thing was failing before deciding how to address it. They argued about the roof, the first real argument, which ended when she was proven right and he acknowledged it with a nod and moved on without any wounded pride about it. She discovered that she was better with the animals than she'd known, or perhaps better with his animals specifically. She had patience with the mules, the right kind of patience, and she figured out within 2 weeks that the older one, a grey named Hector, responded better to a particular sequence of handling before being loaded. Garrick had been managing Hector with brute consistency for years. The observation earned her the first long look from him that meant something other than assessment. She was slower than she wanted to be with the physical work in those first weeks. She'd been strong before. The garden and the house and the mule had kept her there. But mountain strong was different, and she hit the wall of it regularly, muscles failing at points in the day that would have been fine back on the flatlands. She did not pretend otherwise. She stopped when she needed to stop and pushed through when she could push through and kept track of which was which. Garrick, to his credit, did not make an issue of the pace. He worked his own schedule and expected her to work hers and met in the middle where meeting was necessary. It wasn't generous exactly, it was simply fair. That particular fairness she'd identified in him at the trading post, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. He was not an easy man to know. She'd understood that before, and she understood it more clearly now. He went long stretches without speaking, not out of sullenness, she gradually decided, but out of genuine self-sufficiency. He was a man who had spent years in his own company and had become comfortable enough there that conversation was something he selected rather than defaulted to. When he did speak, it meant something. She adjusted to this. What she noticed in those early weeks were the things she hadn't expected. That he was meticulous about the animals in a way that went beyond practicality. That he kept 3 books beside his bunk, though she'd never seen him read them in her presence. That he'd planted a small stand of wildflowers along the south side of the barn at some point years ago and still kept them cleared even though they served no practical purpose. She didn't comment on the flowers, but she noticed them, and sometimes, in the evening, when the light came off the valley in that particular way it had, gold and long and very quiet, she'd look at the view and understand again that same thing she'd felt on arrival. That she had landed somewhere that was harder and more real and more genuinely hers than anything she'd had before. It was not comfort yet. It was something rougher and more honest than comfort. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something that had already been decided. The mountains were not kind, but they were real. And Elara Voss, who had been told her whole life that she was too much, too large, too awkward, too difficult, was beginning to suspect that the mountains didn't agree. She worked. She figured things out. She put one foot in front of the other on difficult ground, which was, when it came to it, the only thing she'd ever really known how to do. And whatever was waiting ahead of her, winter and hard work, and a man who didn't say much but watched everything, and a valley that was beautiful in a way she was still getting used to, she would meet it the same way. One day at a time, with her eyes open. The first snow came early. Elara had been warned. Garrick had told her in his flat, factual way that the upper valley got its first hard frost by mid-September and its first real snow not long after. But knowing a thing and standing in it are different experiences, and when she woke on a morning in late September to find 6 inches of white on the ground, and more falling thick and quiet from a sky the colour of old pewter, she stood in the doorway of the cabin for a full minute before she trusted herself to move. It wasn't fear. It was closer to recalibration, the way your body has to reorganize itself around a new reality before it can function inside it. Behind her, she heard Garrick pull on his boots. "How long does it last?" she asked. "This one? 2, 3 days maybe. Then a break. Then it doesn't stop until April." He said it the way you'd say the creek runs east. Just information, nothing loaded into it. She appreciated that he didn't add anything consoling. She didn't need consoling. She needed accurate information, and he consistently provided that. "The root cellar," she said. "We haven't finished rotating the stores." "I know. Then we should do that before the second layer comes." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. And that was the whole conversation. Just eat. The root cellar became her primary project through those first weeks of autumn, and it was there that Elara began to understand how close things actually were. Garrick had supplies. She'd known that. It was part of why she'd proposed to him. But supplies and sufficient supplies were not the same thing. And when she laid out everything in the root cellar, with the same systematic attention she'd given his ledger, she found gaps that bothered her. Not catastrophic gaps, but winter, she was learning, had a way of turning small shortfalls into serious ones when the weather ran long, and the road stayed closed, and your nearest neighbour was 6 miles down an iced ridge trail. She stood in the cellar with a candle and a piece of paper and wrote down what they had and what they needed and did the arithmetic. She did it twice because the first time the number came out worse than she expected and she wanted to make sure she hadn't made an error. The second time gave her the same number. She brought the paper to Garrick that evening. He looked at it for a while. She watched his face and learned something. He processed information inward, this man. Didn't let it cross his face the way most people did. Whatever he thought about what she'd written, it stayed behind his eyes. "We can get one more supply run in before the high pass closes," he said. "When?" 4 days. Maybe 5. "I should come." He looked up. "It's a hard run. The weather—" "I know what the weather is," she said, not sharply, just stating a fact. "And I know what we need better than you do right now. I made the list." He held her gaze for a moment, then he looked back at the paper. "Boots," he said. "What?" He nodded at her feet. "You've been favoring the left since the second day on the trail. Those boots don't fit you right. Before we make a run in early snow, you need boots that fit." She opened her mouth and closed it again. He was right. She hated that he was right. "There's a cobbler in Black Ridge." "Yes, I'll manage," she said. "You'll manage better with boots that fit," he said, which was an unusually long statement, all the obvious for him, which meant he actually cared about it. She said, "I'm not going back there." He looked at her, not with surprise exactly, more with the look of a man who had expected this and was deciding how to handle it. "It's your town," he said. "It's not my town," she said. "It never was. Either way, you need the boots." She stared at the fire. "I know a woman there who might bring them up. Margaret Holt. She's the dry goods clerk and she knows my size. I can write to her." "Right then," he said, and got up and went to check on the mules. She wrote the letter that night by candle. She kept it practical and gave Margaret the measurements and included enough coin in a separate envelope that she folded into the first. She didn't explain anything. Margaret was a careful woman who asked fewer questions than most in Black Ridge, which was one of the reasons Alara had always liked her. You could tell she noticed things, but chose what to do with the information, which was a form of intelligence the town didn't award enough credit for. She sent the letter with a passing trapper who was heading down mountain 2 days later. The boots arrived 8 days after that, brought up by Margaret herself, which Alara had not expected, and which required her to stand in the doorway of the cabin and look at the woman she'd known since childhood and not know quite what to say. Margaret was small and practical and had sharp brown eyes that took in the homestead and the valley and Garrick's presence in the barn doorway with the same quiet, comprehensive attention she gave to inventory. She said, "You look like you're managing." "I am," Alara said. "Good," Margaret said. "That's what I thought." She handed over the boots. Good ones, heavier than Alara had specified, which meant Margaret had made a judgment call and upgraded them at her own expense. "The town's been interesting since you left," she added, with the careful neutrality of someone reporting a fact rather than offering an opinion. "I imagine it has. Martha Penfield told people you'd be back by August. Then she said September. She doesn't have a new date yet." Alara said, "She won't need one." Margaret nodded once. "That's what I thought," she said again, and declined to come in for coffee, and made her way back down the mountain with the economical speed of a woman who had things to do. Alara stood in the doorway and watched her go and felt something complex move through her. Not grief, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The reminder that there was a world below the tree line where people had made decisions about her and were still, apparently, making them. The reminder that she had left something, even if what she'd left had never really wanted her. She put on the new boots. They fit. She stood and walked across the porch and back and stood still for a moment, just registering the difference of a thing that fit properly. "Better?" Garrick asked. He'd come up from the barn without her noticing. "Yes," she said. He nodded and went inside. The supply run was hard in the way that all honest work in the mountains was hard. Not dramatic, just relentless. 3 days down and back on trails that the early snow had made treacherous in places, with loaded mules and a cold that came off the upper ridges in a way that found the gaps in your clothing no matter how carefully you'd layered. Alara learned things on that run that she wouldn't have learned any other way. She learned the trail at pace, which was different from learning it slowly, as she had on the way in. She learned how Garrick managed the mules through an iced switchback, a specific combination of voice and pressure that was almost a language, one developed over years of working with the same animals. She learned that he ran cold himself, didn't feel the temperature the way she did, needed fewer layers, and had learned to read her shivering as a data point rather than a complaint. She learned that she could keep up. Not comfortably, not without cost, but she could keep up, and she didn't ask for stops she didn't need, and by the third day, he'd adjusted his pace to something that wasn't accommodation, but was something like a natural calibration between two people who were figuring out how to move through the same terrain together. She also learned, and this was the thing she turned over most in her mind afterward, that he watched the mountain constantly in a way that wasn't anxiety, but was very close to conversation. He'd look at a tree line and she'd ask what he was seeing, and the answers were things like, "Snow load's getting heavy on that slope, need to go wide, or creek ice is bad here, the bank's softer than it looks." Not warnings exactly. Information. He was reading the terrain the same way her father had read survey maps, fluently, involuntarily, the way you read something you've read so many times the meaning is already assembled before you're conscious of looking. She started doing the same. She wasn't good at it, not yet, but she started. At Black Ridge, they moved through the trading quickly. Elara had the list and the budget, and she worked through both with the efficiency of someone who'd done accounts long enough to shop with specificity. Garrick handled the heavy goods and the mule management. They were in and out in under 2 hours, which was faster than he usually managed it, he told her on the way back. Why slower before? She asked. I'd forget something. Have to double back. She almost said you should have made a list and stopped herself because it wasn't useful. Instead she said, I'll make the lists. I know, he said. That's the idea. They passed through the edge of the square on the way to the mountain road, and she was aware of the attention, people stopping, watching, the particular silence that falls when a town sees something that both confirms and complicates what it thinks it knows. She kept her eyes forward. She didn't look for Martha Penfield or Tom Beckett or any of the others. She walked at Garrick's pace with her good boots solid on the frozen ground, and she didn't look. But she felt it. She always felt it. The town's opinion was a physical thing, like weather. It just didn't press on her the same way anymore. Winter arrived in full in October, and it was nothing like what she'd known at the lower elevation. This was cold with mass and intention. This was snowfall that measured in feet rather than inches and didn't stop for days at a time. This was wind off the upper ridges that drove the temperature to places she'd had no experience of and taught her very quickly why every piece of equipment Garrick owned was built for exactly these conditions and nothing less. The cabin held. It was small, but it was solid, and Garrick had built it with the kind of obsessive attention to weatherproofing that suggested he'd spent at least one very bad winter understanding what happens when you don't. The fireplace drew well. The walls had been chinked and rechinked until they were near airtight. The roof, their roof, the one she'd helped repair in the fall, held its load without drama. What the winter did was shrink the world down to what was inside the walls and what was between the cabin and the barn. Those 40 feet of path between the two buildings became a significant geography in a blizzard. She learned to move it quickly, head down, knowing exactly where her feet were going. She learned the rhythm of the barn chores. The animals needed water twice a day, feed morning and evening, and there were small signs in their behavior that told you things about their health before anything visible showed. Garrick had taught her these things in the fall, without ceremony, the way you'd explain a tool. Here is what it does. Here is how you use it. She'd taken the information seriously, and it served her. Inside, they worked. She improved the accounts through November, finding patterns in the trading records that told her which goods were most efficiently sourced and which Garrick had been overpaying for out of habit or lack of time to look for better. She organized the stores more carefully, tracking consumption against projection, adjusting the menu as needed to stretch what they had without compromising what they both needed to do hard physical work in brutal cold. Garrick repaired equipment. He spent long evening hours at the work table by the east window with trap mechanisms and harness and tools, his hands moving through the repairs with the same automatic competence he brought to everything physical. He didn't talk much during these hours, but he wasn't absent either. He was clearly aware of the room, and occasionally he'd look up when she asked a question and give her his full attention for as long as the question required. They ate together every evening, which was the most natural thing about it, and also, in ways she was slow to identify, the most important. The table was the place where they were both fully in the room, neither focused on a task, and conversation happened there in a way it didn't happen elsewhere. Not deep conversation, not yet, maybe not ever in the way she'd imagined conversation with a companion might be. But real conversation. The kind that builds up a picture of another person in fragments, a detail here and a small admission there. She learned that he'd been born in the East, Pennsylvania, he said once, and didn't elaborate. That he'd come west at 19 and hadn't gone back. That he'd had a partner in the early years, another trapper, and that the man had died in an accident on the high ridge that Garrick told her about, without sentiment, but with a precision that said it was something he'd turned over many times. She told him about her father in return, about the surveying trips she'd been old enough to go on, the way Caleb Voss had looked at the land with a kind of respectful attention that she'd absorbed without knowing she was absorbing it. About the months after his death, which she described factually, the debt, the garden, the slow arithmetic of a life getting harder, and not with self-pity, which she didn't have much of, and which she didn't think would serve her here anyway. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without interruption, his eyes on his food or his hands or the fire, but his attention clearly on her words. "Your father taught you to survey?" he asked one evening in late November. "The basics. I can read a map better than I can make one, but I can make one." "Why?" "There's a section of the upper valley I've never mapped properly. The creek there does something strange in spring, branches in a way that might be significant for the grazing areas. I've been meaning to look at it for 3 years. We could do it in spring, she said, when the snow breaks. Yes, he said. It was such a small thing. A survey project, practical and ordinary. But it was the first time either of them had spoken about the future as if it was simply a thing they would share, not a negotiation, not a conditional, just an assumption. We could do it in spring. She noticed it after she'd said it. She thought he might have noticed it too, though he gave nothing away. December brought the hardest cold she'd ever experienced, and with it, her first real test. It started with Hector. The old grey mule had been off his feed for 2 days in a way that Ilara noted but couldn't immediately explain. On the third day, she found him standing at the back of the barn with his head dropped lower than usual and a heat coming off his left foreleg that she felt from a foot away. She called Garrick from the cabin. He came and looked and felt the leg with the focused attention of a man who'd dealt with injured animals for 15 years. "Swelling's starting," he said. "He must have knocked it somewhere. Could have been days ago, covered by the coat." "What do we do?" "Keep it cleaned and wrapped. Cold water draws down the swelling, but the creek's frozen at the banks." "The spring behind the root cellar isn't frozen all the way," she said. "I checked it 2 days ago." He looked at her. "You're sure?" "I checked it because I was thinking about the water supply if the main source froze over. It was running at the edge." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Good thinking." They worked on Hector together through that evening and the next 2 days. The cold water draws, the wrapping, the careful monitoring of the inflammation and the animal's temperature. Ilara took the night shifts without being asked because Garrick had trapline work he needed to do in the mornings that she couldn't substitute for, and she could substitute for the night monitoring. She slept in 2-hour intervals on a bedroll in the barn, which was warm enough with the animals in it, though not comfortable by any reasonable definition. On the fourth night, around 2 in the morning, Hector got up on his own and walked to his feed bin and ate. Ilara sat on the bedroll in the straw and watched the mule eat in the lamplight and felt a relief so physical it was almost dizzying. She hadn't realized how tightly wound she'd been around the possibility of losing him until the possibility receded. She heard the barn door and looked up. Garrick stood in the doorway in his coat, having apparently woken and come to check. He looked at Hector eating. He looked at Ilara on the bedroll. "Came around," she said. "I see that." He came and sat on a hay bale near the door, not near her, but in the same space, and they both watched the mule eat in the way you watch a thing that you were worried about and are now relieved by. The barn was quiet except for the animal sounds and the muffled push of wind outside. After a while, Garrick said, "You should have woken me. You had the early line to run." "I know. You should have woken me anyway." She looked at him. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite an order and wasn't quite gratitude, something that sat between the two, in the territory of a man saying you don't have to do this alone without knowing how to say it in those words. "I managed," she said. "I know you managed." A pause. "That's not the point." She held his gaze for a moment. In the lamplight, his face was softer than it looked in daylight, the angles less sharp, the exhaustion more visible and more human. He looked like a man who'd been alone a very long time and had learned to be fine with that and was possibly, slowly, finding the edges of what fine cost him. "Next time," she said, "I'll wake you." He nodded. "Once. Good," he said. They sat in the barn a while longer, neither of them with a reason to leave immediately. Hector finished eating and settled, and the wind did what the wind did, and in the lamplight and the warmth and the animal smell of the barn, 2 people sat with a small distance between them that was less than it had been in September and more than it might someday be, and neither of them said anything about that because there was nothing to say yet. Only the winter, long and ongoing, and the work that filled it, and the slow dailiness of 2 lives learning to share the same ground. That was enough, for now. That was actually quite a lot. Spring came to the upper valley the way it always did in the Krellmore range. Not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard freeze, mud that turned back to ice overnight. The creek rising and dropping and rising again as the snowpack on the upper faces made its slow, unreliable decision about when to let go. Ilara had made it through winter. She didn't frame it that way to herself or to Garrick. There was no ceremony around it, no acknowledgement. They simply arrived at March and the work changed character, moved from the inward, maintenance-heavy grind of deep winter toward the outward-facing work of a homestead coming back to life. The garden beds needed to be turned and assessed. The barn needed the deep clean that winter made impossible. The trap lines were finished for the season, and Garrick began the process of pulling them, cleaning and storing the equipment with the same meticulous attention he'd brought to setting them in October. Ilara did the survey. She'd thought about it through the coldest weeks. The branching creek in the upper valley that Garrick had mentioned. The mapping project they'd agreed on before either of them knew they were agreeing on a future. She pulled her father's instruments from the pack and cleaned the rust off the compass with fine oil and made herself remember the steps Caleb Voss had walked her through on those long-ago survey trips. The ones she'd absorbed half-consciously as a girl and never had occasion to use. She went out 3 mornings in a row and took her readings and made her notes, and on the 4th morning, Garrick came with her without being asked and held the ranging rod in the places she pointed and didn't offer opinions unless she asked for them, which was the correct way to help someone doing technical work. By the end of the week, she had something that resembled a proper sketch map of the Upper Valley's water system, rough in places, approximate in others, but honest. She showed it to him that evening. He looked at it for a long time. "This section," he said, pointing to the eastern branch of the creek where it divided near the aspen grove. "I always thought it ran dry in late summer, but if this is right—" "It doesn't," she said. "It goes underground for about 60 feet and comes back up on the other side of that rock shelf. I found the outlet. You've got water on the east side of the valley through August, probably later." He looked up at her. "That changes the grazing plan. Yes, you could run animals on the east slope through the dry months instead of pulling them to the main creek where everything crowds." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map with the expression he got when he was assembling information. Then he said, "This took you 4 days. 5, counting the day I couldn't get the compass to seat properly. My father's surveyor spent 3 weeks on this valley when I first filed the claim. He missed this entirely." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. Garrick set the map down carefully, the way you set something down when you intend to keep it, and said, "Thank you." 2 words, plain and unadorned, which from him meant something more than most men's speeches. She said, "It's useful work." That's enough. But it wasn't entirely enough, and she knew it, and she thought he probably knew it too. There was something growing in the space between them that neither of them was naming. Not yet. Not because they were unaware of it, but because naming it felt premature, like trying to harvest a crop before it had finished setting. They were careful people, both of them, careful in different ways, and carefulness sometimes meant waiting. She was willing to wait. She had learned patience on harder ground than this. Kyung. The trouble arrived in April, from below. The first sign was a man Ilara didn't recognize on the mountain road. Not a trapper, not a settler, she knew. He was riding a well-fed horse and wearing clothes that were too clean for the trail, the kind of clean that meant he'd come up from a town larger than Black Ridge, somewhere with laundry services and decent hotels. He passed through the valley without stopping, and she watched him from the garden and didn't like the look of him, which was not a rational response, but turned out to be an accurate one. 2 days later, there were 2 more men. Same quality of horse, same out-of-place cleanliness. They stopped at the edge of the homestead and asked for Garrick Hale, and when she told them he was on the upper ridge, they asked if they could wait. She said no. They left, but she noted the direction they rode, and it wasn't back down the mountain. She told Garrick that evening. He listened with a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. What did they look like? She described them. The horses, the clothes, the way the taller one had looked past her at the cabin when she told him Garrick was away. That particular look of a man making an inventory of a place he expects to visit again. Garrick's jaw tightened once and then relaxed. "Krellmore Land Syndicate," he said. She'd heard the name. It had moved through Blackridge the previous summer in whispers, and a company out of the territorial capital that had been buying up land claims in the mountain valleys, sometimes through legitimate purchase and sometimes through means that the whispers described with words like pressure and forced out, and once, from old Peterson at the trading post, men with guns. "They've been working the lower valleys," Garrick said. "I knew they'd come this far eventually. What do they want?" The mineral surveys from 5 years ago showed deposits in the upper Krellmore. Iron ore, possibly silver in the eastern ridges. The syndicate's been acquiring claims over the whole range. He paused. "This valley sits in the middle of the territory they want. Your claim is filed?" "Yes." "Then legally they have to buy me out or prove the claim is invalid. They've done both to other people." His voice was flat and careful. "They found irregularities in 2 claims on the South Vale, things that were technically real but that nobody had ever noticed or cared about until suddenly someone needed them to matter. The Harrow family was off their land in 2 months. Ilara was quiet for a moment. "What irregularities?" "Survey errors, boundary overlaps. One family had filed without the right witness signatures on the original deed." She thought about her father's survey maps, about the copy she'd made of the valley sketch, about the deed to her own 40 acres down in Black Ridge, sitting in the tin box, which was now in the cabin. I want to look at your claim documents, she said. He looked at her. Why? Because if they found errors in other claims, I want to know before they do whether there are errors in yours, and if there are, I want to find out how to fix them before someone uses them as a lever. He got up and went to the chest under his bunk and came back with a folded document that had been handled enough times it was soft at the creases. She spread it on the table and read it with the careful attention she'd given to his account ledgers, line by line, not skipping anything because it seemed obvious, because the obvious things were exactly what people used when they needed to. She read it twice. She made notes on a separate paper. Your survey boundary on the northwest corner references a rock formation as a marker, she said. It's described as the double-faced granite outcrop at the head of the western tributary. I know the one. Is it still there? It was last summer. We need to verify it's still there and that the description matches it exactly. Survey markers get disputed when they're natural features. They move. They get obscured. Someone claims the description is ambiguous. She tapped the document. Also your filing date. It says March of 71. Was that when you filed or when you settled? Filed. I settled the February before. Do you have anything that documents the February date? Any correspondence? Any purchase of supplies that could be dated? He thought. Trading Post records. Hayes kept purchase logs. If the syndicate tries to argue the claim was filed after a competing interest was established, you'd need that. Filing date versus settlement date matters if someone contests priority. She looked up. Your father worked in law, didn't you say? Land surveying. But he understood the documents. He taught you something. More than I used, he said. There was something in his voice that was close to rueful, or as close as Garrick Hale got. We should talk to the other families on this range, Alara said. If the syndicate is moving through the upper valleys, others are getting these visits. People who don't know to look at their documents the way I'm looking at yours. Most of them don't trust me enough to talk to me, she remembered. The neighbor 6 miles down the east ridge, the moved trapline boundary. How many families are we talking about on this range? 7, maybe 8 that have legitimate settled claims, plus another 4 or 5 that are seasonal. And the neighbor. Dunmore. Dell Dunmore. Yes. Does he know about the syndicate? If those men passed through the valley, they passed by his place too. He's downslope. Then he knows, she said. Whether he'll talk to you about it is a different question. Garrick said nothing. The trapline boundary hung between them without being spoken. She said, I'll go. He looked at her sharply. To Dunmore's. Yes. He doesn't know you. He doesn't have a reason to be angry at me either, she said. You and he have history. I'm just a woman he's never met. That's sometimes an advantage. Garrick didn't like it. She could see that. But he didn't argue against the logic of it because it was sound and he knew it was sound. He said, Don't go alone. Take Hector. Hector's still favoring that leg on steep ground. Take the other mule then, and take the rifle. I know how to use a rifle, she said. I know you do. Take it anyway. She went the next morning. Minked. Dell Dunmore's place was smaller than she'd expected, a single-room cabin and a lean-to barn and a kitchen garden that had been worked hard and showed it. Dunmore himself was a compact, weathered man in his 50s with a grey beard and the particular wariness of someone who'd been living alone long enough that unexpected visitors registered as threats before they registered as people. He came out with a rifle across his arm when she rode up. He didn't point it at her, but he didn't put it down either. I'm Alara Hale, she said. She hadn't used the name before, hadn't had occasion to, hadn't been certain how it fit. It fit well enough for this. My husband's Garrick Hale. We're in the upper valley. Dunmore's face did several things in sequence. Hale sent his wife. Nobody sent me, she said evenly. I came because we've both had visitors from the Krellmore Syndicate in the last week, and I wanted to know if you had too. A pause. The rifle didn't move. Why would I tell you anything? Because the syndicate doesn't care about your dispute with my husband. They want the land under both your feet equally. Whatever happened between him and you, it's a smaller problem than what's coming down from the capital. She held his gaze. But that's your decision to make. He studied her with the same assessing attention that Garrick used, though less refined, more openly suspicious, more aware of itself. Then he lowered the rifle. Come inside, he said. The inside of Dunmore's cabin was spare and functional, and smelled of wood smoke and something that might have been cured leather. He poured 2 cups of coffee, a real coffee, which surprised her, and sat across his small table from her and said, They came 3 days ago. 2 men. Asked to see my deed and my survey records. Did you show them? I showed them the deed. I didn't have the survey records. They're in Black Ridge at the land office. She kept her face neutral. That was a problem. What did they say when you told them that? The tall one smiled. Dunmore's mouth flattened. Said that was fine. They'd review what was on file at the land office. Said they were doing a routine audit of claims in the upper range. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. That's not what that is. No, she said. It isn't. She told him what Garrick had told her about the Harrow family and the other displaced claims. She told him about the document review she'd done the previous evening. She told him what she thought the syndicate's strategy was. Find the technical weakness, exploit it quietly through the legal process, make it expensive and complicated enough that families simply couldn't sustain the fight. Dunmore listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What are you proposing?" "I'm not sure yet, but I think we need to know the state of every claim on this range before the syndicate does. And I think people need to know they're not being targeted individually, that this is a coordinated effort across the whole range." She paused. "Would you talk to the Kellermans, the family on the south face?" "I know the Kellermans." "We don't," she said, "and we have less standing to approach strangers than someone they already know." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Hale. He moved a trapline boundary line 3 years ago." "I don't know the details of that," she said. "I know he says the boundary was always where he put it. I know you disagree. I think that dispute is something the two of you have to sit down and work through eventually, because you're going to need to be able to work together on what's coming." She met his eyes. "But that's not why I'm here today." Something moved in Dunmore's face. It wasn't warmth, exactly, more like a reluctant reassessment. "You're direct," he said. "I find it saves time," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but it was real. "I'll talk to the Kellermans," he said. She rode back up the mountain with a cautious sense of something, not victory, not yet, and she was careful not to call it that, more like the feeling of a first stitch in something that had been torn. The situation was bad. The syndicate had resources and legal reach, and they'd done this before. But she'd spent the last 8 months learning that the distance between this is very hard and this is impossible was frequently larger than it appeared from the outside. She got back to the homestead in the late afternoon to find Garrick on the porch. He looked at her, one of his looks, the reading kind. "How did it go?" "He'll talk to the Kellermans," she said. Garrick was quiet for a moment. "He actually talked to you. People generally will, if you give them a real reason." She dismounted and tied the mule and started toward the cabin. At the porch step, she paused. "There's something else," she said. "What?" "His survey records are at the land office in Black Ridge, not on his property. The syndicate can access them." Garrick's expression didn't change, but something in it went very still. "Same could be true for others." "Yes." She looked at him. "We need to move faster than we thought." He nodded slowly. The valley spread behind him in the late afternoon light, long and green with the spring melt, the creek running full, the aspen stands just starting their first pale leaf. Everything they'd worked for in the fall and survived through the winter, and were beginning, carefully, to build toward. The syndicate wanted it. The syndicate wanted all of it. She thought about the numbers she'd written on that kitchen table in August, the arithmetic of a life getting harder. She thought about how close she'd come to having no options at all, and about what it had taken to make herself walk across that square in Black Ridge and say an impossible thing out loud. She had done that. She could do this. "I need access to the land office records," she said, "and I need to know who the syndicate's legal representative is in the capital. Everything they're doing will be documented somewhere. Documents have errors, and errors can be useful." Garrick looked at her with that expression she'd been slowly learning to read. The one that wasn't quite admiration, but was its nearest neighbor in a man who didn't come easily to admiration. "I know someone in the Territorial Records Office," he said. "We worked a boundary dispute together years ago. He's reliable." "Write to him tonight." "Already thinking it," he said. They went inside. She put the rifle back on its hooks above the door and hung up her coat, and Garrick sat down at the table with paper and a pen. And outside, the spring evening moved over the valley with the particular quality that good land has in good light, beautiful and ordinary and very much worth keeping. Neither of them said that. They didn't need to. The letter had to be written, and there was dinner to make. And the trouble was real and growing. But so were they, growing into something together, incrementally, the way everything real grows. Not all at once, not cleanly, but steadily. And in the mountains, steadiness was the thing that lasted. It was 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early May, that everything got worse. She was in the garden when she heard the shot. A single shot from somewhere up the ridge above the cabin. The direction Garrick had gone that morning to check the condition of the fence line he'd been building along the north pasture boundary. She knew it was his rifle because she knew the sound of it, had learned the sound of it over the winter. She knew also, immediately, that it wasn't the kind of shot a man fires at a fence post. She ran. The trail up the North Ridge was steep, and she went up it faster than she'd ever gone up anything, her heart in her throat, her boots finding the path without her consciously directing them. She was shouting his name before she'd made the first switchback, and she didn't care how it sounded. She found him 2/3 of the way up, in a section of trail that opened briefly before narrowing again at a rock face. He was on the ground, partially propped against a boulder, one hand pressed to his left side. 3 men stood around him, the same 2 she'd seen on the road in April, plus a third she hadn't seen before, heavy-set and unhurried in the way of a man who is used to being the largest presence in any situation. The heavy-set man had a rifle. It wasn't pointed at Garrick anymore. It was pointed loosely at the ground between them, but loosely was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Ilara stopped at the edge of the clearing. Her rifle was on its hooks above the door of the cabin, 40 feet below. She had a knife in her belt. She was breathing hard from the run. None of this was ideal. She looked at Garrick. He met her eyes. He was pale under his weathered colour, but his eyes were clear and focused, and the look he gave her said, "Stay calm. Think." "Mrs. Hale," said the heavy-set man. He had a voice that was smooth, in the way of someone who'd learned that smoothness was more effective than volume. "I'm sorry you had to come up in such a hurry. Your husband had a small accident." "He was shot," she said. Her voice came out level. She didn't know how. "He came at Mr. Carey here," the man said, indicating one of the other 2. Carey reacted. "It's unfortunate." It was a lie so brazen it almost didn't register as a lie. Garrick Hale did not charge at armed men on a mountain trail. She looked at Carey and saw on his face the particular expression of a man who is used to having his lies supported and doesn't bother to make them convincing. "My name is Hollis Crane," the heavy-set man said. "I represent the Krellmore Mineral and Land Syndicate. I believe you're familiar with our organization." "I've heard of it." "Then you know we've been working to consolidate land holdings in this range for development purposes. We've had productive conversations with most of your neighbors." He smiled. The smile was technically correct. All the right muscles in the right places. "We'd like to have a productive conversation with you." "My husband is bleeding," she said. "He is. And we'd like to help with that, of course. We have a man in Black Ridge who can—" "What are your terms?" she said. Crane paused. She'd surprised him, which was what she'd intended, cut through the performance and get to the number, because the number was the only real information in this conversation. He recovered quickly. "We're prepared to offer a fair market valuation for the claim. Given the mineral survey data, that figure would be—" "I'm not interested in the figure yet," she said. "I'm asking about your terms. The method of transfer. The timeline you're proposing. The nature of the deed you'd want us to sign." Crane's smile thinned at the edges, just slightly. He was reassessing her. She could see him doing it. "Those are details we'd discuss in a formal setting, with legal representation present," she said. "Of course. Then we'll discuss it in a formal setting with legal representation present." She looked at Garrick. He'd shifted his weight against the boulder, pressing harder on his side, and the colour in his face was not improving. She looked back at Crane. "And you'll let me get my husband down this trail to the cabin. As I said, we're happy to assist." "You've done enough assisting," she said. "Step back." Something passed through Crane's face. Not anger exactly, more like the recalculation of a man who had expected a different kind of woman. He looked at her for a beat, and she held his eyes without moving, without blinking, without giving him anything to work with. He stepped back. He gestured to the other 2, and they stepped back as well. She went to Garrick. Up close, the wound was in the left side between the ribs and the hip. She could see from the way he was pressing on it and the amount of blood that it had hit muscle and possibly more, and she felt the fear of it land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. But she had the presence of mind not to show it. She crouched beside him and put her hand over his to look. "How bad?" he said, low for her ears. "I don't know yet," she said. "Equally low. Can you walk? With help. You're going to lean on me." "You're not—" "Don't," she said quietly. And the one word had enough in it that he stopped. She put her shoulder under his arm and helped him up, and he was heavy, genuinely heavy, in the way of a man built for hard work. And it took everything she had to get them both upright and moving, but she was not small. She had never been small. And whatever the town of Black Ridge had decided that meant, up here on this ridge with this man's weight against her shoulder and 3 hostile men watching from a distance, it meant she could carry him. She walked him down the trail. Crane called after them, "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Hale. The offer has a time frame." She didn't answer. She walked Garrick down and got him through the cabin door and got him to the bed and got his coat and shirt off to look at the wound properly. And what she found was bad enough to require everything she'd learned from her mother about wound care, the knowledge that had seemed theoretical until this moment, and the full contents of the medical kit she'd organised in September and thanked herself for now. She worked for 2 hours. She cleaned and packed the wound, which was deep but had missed anything vital by a margin she was grateful not to calculate too precisely. He lost consciousness once and came back. She talked to him while she worked, not comforting words exactly, practical words, the same way he talked to the mules. Stay with me, this part will hurt, hold still, breathe. He stayed with her. When she'd done what she could do and had him stabilized and covered, she sat on the edge of the bed with blood on her hands and looked at the wall of the cabin. Crane's voice in a pihenna in her head, the offer has a time frame. Outside, the valley was green and quiet and fully itself. The creek was running. The aspen leaves were new and pale and moved in the light wind off the upper ridge. Everything she'd helped build here over 8 months was visible from this window. If she turned to look. She didn't turn to look. She sat with what she knew. The syndicate had shot her husband on his own land and called it an accident and expected them to sign a piece of paper and leave. She thought about the documents spread across the table in the other room. The letters she and Garrick had been writing to the Territorial Records Office, to the other families on the range, to Margaret's brother-in-law who worked in land law in the capital. The beginnings of something she hadn't yet had a name for. She had a name for it now. She looked at Garrick. His face in sleep was unguarded in a way it never was awake, younger, and more tired and more plainly human. She thought about a barn in December and a lamp burning and the particular quality of silence between two people who don't yet know what they are to each other. She thought about we could do it in spring, and the map on the table, and boots that fit, and a mule that got up and walked to his feed bin at 2 a.m. while she watched from a bedroll in the straw. She was not going to let them have this. She was not going to let them have any of it. She stood up, washed her hands in the basin, dried them, and went to the table where the documents were. She sat down and picked up the pen. There was work to do. Garrick ran a fever for 4 days. It wasn't the wound itself that turned dangerous. The cleaning had been thorough enough, the packing tight enough. It was the deep muscle inflammation that set in on the second night, the kind of infection that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but builds quietly until the body decides to fight it all at once. He burned through 2 nights so hot she could feel the heat rising off him from the other side of the bed, and she sat with him through both of those nights doing what could be done. Cold cloths on his neck and forehead, water pressed to his lips every hour whether he was conscious enough to swallow it or not. The wound checked and redressed each morning with hands that she kept steady through force of will she couldn't have quantified. He surfaced on the 4th day. Not recovered, not close to recovered, but back behind his eyes, the fever broken into something manageable. He looked at her from the pillow with an expression that was half relief and half something she didn't have a word for yet. "How long?" he said. His voice was rough and thin. 4 days. He processed that. The letters. Sent. The one to your contact in the Territorial Records Office went out the morning after. I rode down to the first way station myself. The ones to the Kellermans and the Harrows I gave to Dunmore. He blinked slowly. Dunmore came. The day after you were shot. I sent for him. She paused. He came the same afternoon. Something moved through Garrick's face at that. Something complicated, the look of a man updating a long-held assessment. What did he say? He said that Crane's men had been on his property that morning and that they'd told him the offer window was 2 weeks. She kept her voice even. He also said that 3 other families on the south face had received the same message with the same deadline. 2 weeks, Garrick repeated. 12 days now. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him do the same thing she'd seen him do with the supply lists and the ledgers and the survey map, assemble information into a picture, find the shape of the problem. I can't ride in 12 days, he said. I know. Lara, I know, she said again, and the way she said it stopped him. She looked at him directly. I'm not waiting for you to be able to ride. I'm sorry, but I'm not. We don't have the time. He held her gaze. She could see him calculating, assessing her, the situation, the options, doing the math the same way she'd done the math on that kitchen table 8 months ago. He didn't like what the math said. She understood that. She didn't entirely like it herself. Tell me what you've planned, he said. She told him. All of it. What she'd been doing for the 4 days he was unconscious and the 12 days before that, when they'd both been working towards something neither of them had fully named yet. The correspondence, the document review, the network of connections she'd been carefully mapping the way her father had mapped terrain. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the cabin was quiet except for the wind outside and the small sounds of the fire. "The Eastern Pass," he said. "If they block that, they can't block it legally without a court order, and a court order takes 30 days minimum from the territorial capital. I checked." She pulled the relevant letter from the stack on the table and showed him the paragraph. "Their 2-week deadline is a pressure tactic, not a legal one. We have more time than they want us to think." "They don't need legal means to block a pass," he said. She met his eyes. "No, they don't." The silence between them had a different weight now. The weight of what had happened on the North Ridge Trail, of what Cranesman Carey had done and called an accident. She didn't minimize it. She let it sit there. "I'm going to need you to trust me," she said. "I trust you," he said. It came out without hesitation, without qualification, and it landed differently than she expected. More squarely, more real. Not "I think you can handle this" or "I believe in you," with the slight condescension those phrases always carried. Just, "I trust you." Flat and true, the way he said everything that mattered. She looked at the letters on the table. 12 days of work in ink and paper, and borrowed horses and conversations she'd initiated with people who didn't know her. "Rest," she said. "Drink the water I left. I'll be back by evening." She picked up her coat and her father's surveying satchel, which now contained rather more than surveying equipment, and she went out to find the people who were going to have to decide whether to stand together or fall separately, because Hollis Crane and the Krellmore Syndicate were counting on them to do the latter, and she had decided that was not how this was going to go. The gathering happened at Dunmore's place, which was the most central to the 8 families Alara had managed to reach in the previous 2 weeks. It was not an easy thing to organize. These were people who had built their lives at distance from each other by choice, who had learned to solve their own problems because depending on neighbors in the mountains was a habit that the mountains occasionally punished. They were not disposed toward meetings or collective anything, but Crane's men had been to every single one of them, and fear is a better organizer than any individual argument. And when Alara rode from homestead to homestead in those 12 days, in weather that shifted from spring warm to a late cold snap and back again, over trails that Garrick's maps and her own growing knowledge of the range made navigable in ways they wouldn't have been 6 months earlier, she found people who were afraid and who were trying to not look afraid, which is the specific condition that makes a person willing to listen to someone who seems to know what to do. She wasn't certain she knew what to do, but she knew more than they did, because she'd spent 4 sleepless nights reading every document she could get her hands on, and she'd had a letter back from Garrick's contact in the records office, a man named Price, methodical and careful and apparently still loyal, that contained information so useful she'd read it 3 times before trusting herself to act on it. 14 people came to Dunmore's cabin on a Thursday afternoon in mid-May. 8 families, or the representatives of 8 families. Some had sent husbands, some had sent wives. The Kellermans had sent both because, as the wife told Alara at the door, they'd decided they were making this decision together and didn't see why it should be otherwise. Del Dunmore had made coffee and said almost nothing, which was the right contribution from a man in his position. He'd been the one to reach out to half these people, had traded on whatever goodwill he had, and now it was up to Alara to justify the expenditure. She stood at the front of the room. It wasn't a big room. 14 adults in it was a press of bodies and nervous warmth, and she put her father's map of the Krellmore range on the table where people could see it, and she said without preamble, "The Krellmore Syndicate has been telling each of you that you have a problem that only they can solve. I want to show you that isn't true, and then I want to show you what we can actually do." She told them about Price's letter. What it had revealed was this. 3 of the Syndicate's existing land acquisitions in the lower Krellmore had been processed through a single territorial land office clerk named Aldous Webb. No relation to Marcus in Blackridge, just an unlucky coincidence of name, who had, over the course of 18 months, approved transfer documents with a speed and uniformity that suggested he was not reading them carefully. Price had flagged 2 of these approvals as potentially irregular, with documentation from the original claimants showing the circumstances of the sale, pressure, threats, misrepresented terms. There was grounds for a formal review petition to the Territorial Land Commissioner. "What does that mean for us?" asked a man named Kellerman, the husband, broad and deliberate in his speech. "They already have those claims. It means the Syndicate's entire acquisition strategy in this range is built on a foundation that a formal petition can challenge. It doesn't guarantee we win, but it means they have something to lose by pushing too hard on any individual claim, because each time they do, it draws attention to the pattern." She paused. "They don't want attention. They want quiet transactions that don't get reviewed." "They shot Garrick Hale," said a woman from the back, Marta Solis, whose family ran cattle on the western slope. She said it plainly, not dramatically, just as a data point. "That's not a quiet transaction." No, Ilara said, it isn't. And that's a mistake on their part, because it changes what I can include in a petition to the Land Commissioner's office. She pulled a folded document from the satchel, the written account she'd prepared of the incident on the North Ridge Trail, signed by herself and witnessed by Dunmore, who had come up the morning after and seen the wound himself. A land dispute is one thing, an armed assault on a settled claimant is another. The room was quiet. If we file individually, she said, we each have a grievance, a complaint, something a syndicate lawyer can address one at a time slowly until we run out of money, or will, or both. She looked around the room, at the tired faces, the cautious eyes, the bodies of people who had worked very hard for what they had and knew exactly what it would cost to lose it. If we file together, with documented evidence from multiple families showing a consistent pattern of misrepresentation and coercion, we have something a territorial commissioner has to treat seriously. Because if he doesn't, it goes to the territorial court. And syndicate lawyers do not want a territorial court looking at Aldous Webb's approval records. Kellerman's wife, a lean, sharp-eyed woman who had said nothing until this moment, said, "Who files it? Who puts their name on the petition?" "I do," Ilara said. "And anyone who's willing to sign alongside me. The more names, the stronger the petition, but I'll file it regardless." "On your own?" she said. Not skeptical exactly, more like she was locating the specific shape of what was being asked. "My husband can't ride yet, but the filing doesn't require him to ride. It requires someone to bring the documents to the capital and stand in front of the right people and not flinch." She paused. "I've been practicing not flinching for most of my life." Something passed through the room at that. She felt it rather than saw it, a slight shift in the collective attention, a settling, the way a room settles when it finds its center of gravity. Marta Solis spoke again. "What do you need from us?" "Signed statements, documenting what Crane's men said to you, on what date, with what specific claims about your deeds or your filing status, as detailed as you can make them. I need them within 5 days." She looked around the room again. "And I need you to not sign anything the syndicate puts in front of you until this petition is filed. Whatever they say about deadlines, whatever pressure they apply, don't sign." "That's easy to say," said a man she didn't know from the edge of the group. Young, nervous, the owner of a claim on the northern ridge that was probably the most exposed of all of them. "Yes," she said, "it is easy to say and it's going to be hard to do. I know that." She looked at him directly. "I'm not asking you to be comfortable. I'm asking you to wait." He looked back at her. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no, which was the beginning of yes for someone who wasn't certain yet. The 5 days were not clean or simple. Nothing about the next 2 weeks was. Crane's men came back. They came to the Kellermans and pushed harder on the timeline. They came to the young man on the northern ridge, his name was Tate, she learned later, and told him the offer had been revised downward, implying that it would continue to fall if he delayed. They came to the access trail that connected the upper valley to the main mountain road and stationed 2 men there for 3 days in a way that wasn't technically blocking it, but made anyone who wanted to use it very aware of being watched. Ilara rode around them. There was a secondary route, longer, worse footing, through the aspen grove on the eastern slope, that she'd identified on her survey of the upper valley. She'd gone back and scouted it on foot the week after the gathering and found it passable for a single rider, harder for pack animals, but not impossible. She used it every time she needed to move without the syndicate's men knowing where she was going. She didn't tell Garrick about the men on the trail until the 3rd day, when they left. He was upright by then, not mobile in any real sense, but sitting at the table for meals and capable of sustained conversation without it costing him too much. When she told him about the route through the aspen grove, his face went through something complicated. "You've been going around them," he said. "Yes, alone. I had the rifle." He looked at her for a long moment. She waited. She was getting better at waiting with him, understanding the silences as functional rather than empty. "That route is unstable in spring melt," he said finally. "The east bank above the grove undercuts. I noticed that. I stayed 10 feet from the bank." 15, he said. "Stay 15 feet. She looked at him. 15 feet, she said. "All right." It was the closest either of them came to the conversation that they weren't having yet, the one about what the last 3 weeks had actually been and what it meant that she'd nursed him through a fever and ridden alone around armed men on a potentially unstable slope and organized a meeting of 8 mountain families and done all of it while he lay in a bed unable to stop her. The conversation about what she was to him now and what he was to her and whether what had been true quietly for some time was going to be said out loud or just lived. They were still not having that conversation, but they were living it. Steadily. In the space between 15 feet from the bank and the letters still stacking on the table and the sound of him moving around the cabin more each day, slower and more careful than before but moving. Price came on a Tuesday. He arrived in the late morning, a lean, angular man in his 50s, with the ink-stained hands of someone who spent his professional life in documents and the careful eyes of someone who'd learned that documents contained more than their words. He'd ridden 4 days from the capital, which was more than Alara had asked him to do and considerably more than she'd expected. He sat at the table with the coffee she made and the full stack of materials she'd assembled, the signed statements from 7 families, the incident report from the North Ridge, Price's own letter cross-referenced with the documents she'd gathered, and the original survey maps in her father's hand that formed the bedrock of the Hale claim's legitimacy. He went through everything methodically. He asked questions that were precise and not many and never condescending. He asked Garrick 2 questions, about the original filing date and about the nature of the encounter with Aldous Webb at the Territorial Land Office 6 years prior, and he wrote down the answers in his own notebook without comment. Then he sat back and looked at the assembled materials. "This is good work," he said. He looked at Alara when he said it. "Is it enough?" she asked. "For a formal petition to the Commissioner?" "Yes. For a review that puts the Webb approvals under scrutiny, possibly if we can get the right set of eyes on it." He turned a page in his notebook. "What you have here is pattern evidence. The Commissioner can ignore a single claim. He'll have a much harder time ignoring documented misrepresentation across 8 families with a consistent methodology." "Crane," Garrick said. It wasn't a question. "Hollis Crane has done this before," Price said. "Southern Range 4 years ago. He acquired 9 claims in 14 months before anyone noticed the pattern. By then the acquisitions were complete." He looked at Garrick. He expected the same thing here. "He didn't expect her," Garrick said. Price glanced at Alara. She thought she saw something flicker in the man's careful eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like the satisfaction of a theory confirmed. "No," he said. "I don't think he did." The petition was filed 9 days later. Alara rode to the capital herself. 4 days, Price accompanying her for the first 2 and meeting her at the land office for the filing, and stood in a room that smelled of old paper and institutional authority, and presented the documentation to a man named Commissioner Hatch, who had the expression of someone who had seen many things and was mildly interested in whether this would be one of them. He read the summary. He asked 3 questions. He looked at the incident report from the North Ridge with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he stamped the petition accepted and said the review would begin within 30 days. She rode home. The syndicate did not collapse immediately. That would have been too clean, and nothing about this was clean. Crane sent another letter, formal this time, through a lawyer in the capital, language carefully drained of anything that could be characterized as a threat. The letter proposed a reduced offer and a new timeline. Alara wrote back through Price, referring them to the pending review petition and noting that communications about the claims should be directed to the Commissioner's office for the duration of the review process. Crane's men disappeared from the mountain road. Not because the fight was over, it wasn't, but because the syndicate's lawyers had evidently advised that visible presence on the trail of families who had just filed a coercion complaint with the Territorial Commissioner was, legally speaking, a poor strategy. The families on the range kept to their claims. Tate, the young man from the Northern Ridge who'd been most uncertain at Dunmore's gathering, sent Alara a written statement so detailed and carefully composed that it took her 20 minutes to read. She wrote him back a note that said it was exactly what was needed and meant it. Kellerman fixed his fence line. Marta Solis moved her cattle to the east slope of the Western Ridge and found, in early June, that the grazing was better than she'd expected, which she relayed to Alara with a satisfaction that came through even in a short written note. Dunmore came up the mountain to the Hale homestead on a Thursday morning in late May, unannounced, which was unusual enough that Alara was on the porch with her hand near the rifle before she recognized him on the trail. He rode up and dismounted and stood for a moment looking at the valley with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he looked at Garrick, who'd come out behind her. Garrick looked back. Neither of them spoke for a moment. A silence she chose not to interrupt, because it had a quality to it that belonged to them. Dunmore said, "The east trapline boundary." "Yes," Garrick said. "I moved it," Dunmore said. "Not by much. I moved it because the season was bad and I needed the territory." He looked at Garrick's face and then looked away. That was wrong. Garrick was quiet. "I know why you moved it," he said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Garrick said. "It doesn't." A pause. "But it explains it." Dunmore nodded. He looked out at the valley again. He said, "She organized 8 families who don't agree on anything." He said it without sentimentality, just as an observation, and then he looked at Alara and gave her a nod that was small and genuine and contained a kind of respect that she recognized because she'd spent a long time being given its opposite. She said, "You reached the Kellermans. I couldn't have done it without that." He shook his head slightly, not dismissing what she'd said, just declining to take too much of the credit. He stayed for coffee. He and Garrick talked about the trapline with the stilted, careful quality of men who had both decided to move forward but were feeling the weight of the ground behind them. It wasn't a reconciliation in any cinematic sense. There was no dramatic moment, no resolution of every grievance. It was two men having a difficult conversation without walking away from it. That was enough. After he left, Alara stood on the porch in the late afternoon light and watched the trail until he disappeared below the first ridge, and Garrick stood beside her, closer than he usually stood, and the valley was very green below them, and the creek caught the sun in that particular way it had when the water was high and running clear. She said, "What happens if the commissioner's review doesn't go our way?" "Then we find another way," he said. "We've been saying that." "Yes," he said, "and we've been finding them." He paused. "You've been finding them." She looked at the valley. She looked at the cabin and the barn and the garden beds that were full and properly staked now and the stands of aspen moving in the warm late spring wind. She thought about August and a kitchen table and arithmetic that didn't lie. She thought about a market square and laughter and the sound of her own voice saying an impossible thing while she stood inside it. "I had a lot to work with," she said. She felt him look at her, that particular attention, the full kind. She kept her eyes on the valley. After a while he said, "Alara." She turned. His face was open in a way it rarely was, not unguarded exactly, but deliberate, like he had decided to let her see something he usually kept behind his eyes. He said, "I should tell you." He stopped. He started again. "That night in the barn. December, with the mule. I remember. I should have said something then. I didn't know how to." His jaw tightened once and released. "I'm still not sure I know how to." She looked at him. She thought about 12 days of riding alone through difficult terrain with a stack of documents in her father's satchel, and the fever she'd sat through, and the boots that fit, and we could do it in spring. She thought about all the things that had been accumulating between them, in the way that things accumulate, slowly, without announcement until the weight of them is undeniable. She said, "You don't have to know how to, you just have to say it." He looked at her for another moment, then, "I'm glad you came across that square." It was not, by conventional measure, a declaration. It was not eloquent. It would not have moved anyone who wasn't aware of how much it had cost him to say something he didn't already know how to say. It moved her. "So am I," she said. They stood on the porch in the good light, and neither of them said anything more, and the valley held itself in the particular stillness of late afternoon, and somewhere on the east slope a hawk rode the thermals in long, patient circles above the aspen grove where she'd found the creek's hidden outlet in early spring. The review was still pending. The syndicate was still real. There was still a great deal of uncertain ground ahead. But so was this. Whatever this was, solid and growing and honestly earned by two people who had started with a practical agreement and arrived somewhere neither of them had put on a map. That was real too. And in the mountains, real was the only thing that lasted Isa ain't. The commissioner's review took 41 days. Ilara knew because she counted them. Not obsessively, she had too much work to be obsessive about anything. But she was aware of the number the way you're aware of a sound in the walls of a house. Present, low grade, never fully absent from your attention, no matter what else your hands were doing. The garden came in strong that summer. She'd restructured the beds in spring based on what she'd learned from the failure of the previous year, moved the root vegetables to the shadier north section, where they wouldn't bolt in August heat, built the trellises 3 inches taller for the beans. The creek ran well through June. The east slope grazing that she'd identified on the survey was exactly what she'd told Garrick it would be. Good ground, dependably watered, better than anything they'd been using. He moved the animals there in late May, and the difference in their condition by July was visible and measurable. He was healing, slower than he wanted to, and faster than she'd feared. Those two things were both true, and she held them both without trying to resolve the tension. He worked at 2/3 of his former capacity through June and pushed toward 3/4 in July, and she watched him the way she watched the weather, not to control it, but to understand what it was doing so she could respond accurately. When he overdid it, which happened 3 times, each time because he misjudged what his body would allow, she didn't lecture him. She just made sure the next morning's work was organized in a way that started slower and built rather than hitting the wall at noon. He noticed. He didn't comment on it directly, which was his way. But she caught him watching her arrange the morning's tasks once with an expression that she'd learned to read as something between gratitude and the mild frustration of a man who doesn't like needing things managed for him, and she understood that both parts of that were real and didn't require her to choose between them. They were figuring each other out. That was the honest description of Obese. Not smoothly. There were mornings that were short and evenings that had a tension neither of them named, and at least 2 arguments that were really about fear rather than whatever they appeared to be about on the surface. He went silent in ways that took her too long to interpret, and she went methodical in ways that he sometimes read as cold when she meant it as functional. These were the actual textures of 2 people sharing a life, and she was learning to trust that the textures didn't mean the foundation was wrong. On the 41st day, Price rode up with a letter. She saw him coming from the garden and walked to meet him at the gate, and his face when he dismounted gave her nothing to read, which was itself information, because Price's face when things were bad tended to carry the news before he opened his mouth. Commissioner Hatch made his ruling, he said. She took the letter. She read it on the porch while Price waited, and Garrick came out from the barn and stood in the yard watching her face. The review had found systematic irregularities in 11 of the Krellmore Syndicate's land acquisitions across the Krellmore Range. The 3 approvals processed by Aldous Webb, now suspended pending his own investigation, had been granted on the basis of documentation that the Commissioner's office had determined was materially misleading in its representation of claimant consent. 2 of those 3 acquisitions were being reversed, meaning the original claimants got their land back. The 3rd was more complicated and would go to territorial court. The petition filed by Alara Hale, representing 9 families of the Upper and Mid Krellmore Range, had been granted in full. No syndicate claim against any of the 9 properties would be recognised pending the completion of the broader review. Any party attempting to enforce a transfer during the review period would be in contempt of the Commissioner's office. She read it twice. She read the key paragraph a 3rd time to make sure she hadn't wanted it to say something so badly that she'd read it wrong. It said what it said. She looked up at Garrick. His face was still. That particular stillness that meant he was processing something significant. She held up the letter. She didn't say anything because there wasn't a sentence available to her that was the right size for what she felt. He crossed the yard and took the letter and read it. Price stood to the side with his hat in his hands, giving them the moment. When Garrick finished reading, he stood with the letter and looked at the valley for a moment, long enough that she started to wonder what he was thinking, and then he looked at her, and what was on his face was not relief exactly. It was something rawer than relief. Relief is what you feel when the threat passes. What she saw on his face was the expression of a man who had spent a long time believing that the things he'd built could be taken and was adjusting slowly and incompletely to the possibility that they couldn't. "It's not permanent," she said. "The broader review still runs. The syndicate can appeal." "I know," he said, "but it's enough to hold on." "Yes," he said, "it is." Price stayed for lunch. They ate at the table with the windows open to the summer air, and Price told them what he knew about the syndicate's likely next moves. Probably an appeal through the territorial courts, probably a shift toward the lower Krellmore where claims were more exposed, probably a quieter strategy than the one Crane had been running. The pressure would not vanish. But it had changed shape. When you face a coordinated effort against 9 families instead of individual negotiations with isolated ones, the calculus changes for the people writing the checks behind the syndicate's operations. Crane, Garrick said, suspended from operating on behalf of the syndicate pending the investigation into the North Ridge incident, Price said. That was in a separate communication this morning. He looked at Garrick's side, the slight way Garrick sat, still compensating for the wound without entirely being aware he was doing it. "It won't be a criminal proceeding. I want to be honest about that. His man Carey will claim it was a misunderstanding, and there are no witnesses beyond you and Mrs. Hale." "I know," Garrick said. His voice was flat, not resigned, just accurate about what the world was. "But he's out of the range, and the syndicate's legal exposure is significant enough that pushing aggressively on new acquisitions in this area is going to be harder to justify internally." Price paused. "You're not safe permanently, but you've bought time and standing that you didn't have 2 months ago." Alara said, "That's what I'll tell the families. They'll want to hear it from you." Price said, "The petition was in your name. You're the one they'll be looking to." She looked at the letter on the table, at her own handwriting in the cover document, the careful, legible hand her father had taught her, the one she'd used for his accounts and the homestead ledger, and 8 months of correspondence that had built toward this moment. She said, "I'll write to them this week." She wrote to all 9 families over the course of 4 days. covering the range in a pattern she'd learned to think of as her own. The trail she knew now the way she'd once known the streets of Black Ridge, by instinct rather than conscious effort. The responses varied the way people's responses always vary when they receive news they've been afraid to need. The Kellermans read the letter together at their kitchen table, and Mrs. Kellerman cried briefly and without apology, and then made Ilara stay for supper, which she did. Martha Solis shook her hand with the firm grip of someone who still had reservations, but was prepared to acknowledge the outcome. Tate, the young man on the northern ridge, read the letter 3 times in silence and then said, with a directness that surprised her, "I wouldn't have made it without this. I was 3 days from signing what they put in front of me." He said it plainly, not to flatter her, but because it was true, and he decided truth was owed. She appreciated that. Dunmore said nothing when she told him. He stood in the doorway of his cabin and read the letter and handed it back and looked out at his land. The pasture, the small kitchen garden, the lean-to where he kept his tools. Then he said, "Come in, I'll make coffee." They sat at his table and drank bad coffee and talked for an hour about practical things. The grazing arrangements now that the east slope access was clear, the trapline boundaries, the question of whether it made sense for the upper range families to formalize some kind of communication network rather than relying on the informal system they'd stumbled into during the crisis. She told him her thought about Price, that he'd been valuable and might be willing to maintain a connection to the upper range on a retainer basis. Someone in the capital they could call on without starting from nothing next time something like this came through. "Next time," Dunmore said. Not skeptical, just noting the shape of the thought. "There's always a next time," she said. "The land doesn't stop being valuable. The people who want it don't stop wanting it." He looked at her with those careful grey eyes. "You're planning to stay," he said. "Yes," she said. And the certainty of it surprised her slightly. Not because it was uncertain, but because she hadn't said it out loud before, and saying it out loud made it more solid than it had been in her head. "This is where I live." He nodded. "Good," he said, which, from Del Dunmore, was a full endorsement. It was in August, a year after she'd walked across that square in Black Ridge, that Margaret Holt came up the mountain again. She came with her brother-in-law, the land lawyer named Sutter, who wanted to understand the petition structure Ilara had built because he thought it had applicability to 3 other range disputes he was working in the territory. She had agreed to meet with him. But it was Margaret she saw first, waiting on the porch with her characteristic patience while Sutter walked the property with Garrick, and it was Margaret she sat with in the afternoon while the men talked land and she poured the coffee, better coffee than Dunmore's, and looked at her oldest acquaintance and tried to find the right shape for what she wanted to say. Margaret got there first. "You look different," she said. "I am different," Ilara said. "Heavier," Margaret said, and then immediately, "I don't mean that the way—" "I know what you mean," Ilara said. "More settled, more solid." She looked down at her hands, which had the roughness of a year of mountain work on them and were no longer the hands she'd had in Black Ridge. "Yes." "Martha Penfield," Margaret said and stopped. Ilara waited. "She said, when Price's review came through, she'd heard about it in town, it was in the territorial paper. She said that you'd gotten lucky, that the syndicate had picked the wrong territory, and you just happened to be in the right place." Margaret held her coffee cup with both hands. "Tom Breckett told her to shut up." Ilara looked at her. "Tom Breckett." "I know," Margaret said. "I was as surprised as you are." A small pause. "People talk about you differently now. I don't know how to explain it exactly. It's like you were always there and now you're somewhere else, and the somewhere else is real in a way that the being there wasn't. If that makes any sense." "It makes sense," Ilara said. "They're not all sorry," Margaret said, because she was a careful woman who didn't oversimplify. "Some of them have just updated the story they tell about you, which isn't the same as being sorry. Martha Penfield isn't sorry. She just doesn't bring you up as often." "I don't need them to be sorry," Ilara said, and meant it. She'd turned that over enough times in the past year to know where she'd landed on it. "I needed to not be there anymore. That was the thing I needed." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Are you happy?" Ilara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about mornings in the garden in the good light. She thought about evenings at the table with the accounts and the maps and Garrick's voice when he read something she'd written and said, "This is good," without adding anything to it. She thought about the hawk over the aspen grove and Hector eating in the lamplight and winter that she had survived and summer that she was living in fully with her whole body in a way she had not known was possible for her. She said, I'm working very hard at something real. That's the best I can tell you. Margaret nodded. It was enough. Margaret had always been good at knowing what was enough. That evening, after Sutter and Margaret had ridden back down and the homestead was quiet again, Ilara sat on the porch in the cooling air and Garrick came and sat beside her, in the chair he'd moved there sometime in June without comment, which had placed it close enough to hers that the arrangement meant something, even though nothing had been said about it, meaning something. He had a cup of coffee and she had one, and the valley was in its late summer evening mode, gold and long and very still, the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself as beautiful but simply is, in the way that things are when they've stopped needing to prove anything. She said, "Can I ask you something I should have asked a long time ago?" "Yes." "The square," she said. "In Black Ridge, when I asked you." She paused. "You'd never spoken more than 20 words to me before that morning. I was a stranger. Half the town was laughing." She looked at him. "Why did you say yes?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the processing quiet, she'd learned the difference, but the quiet of someone deciding how honest to be about something they've thought about privately for a long time. "Because you were honest," he said. "Not brave, not... I don't mean it like that. I mean you didn't dress it up. You said what it was. You gave me real terms." He looked at his coffee cup. "I'd been lied to enough times, in enough different ways, that someone saying a true thing plainly was some..." He stopped, started again. "It was rare. It was worth paying attention to." She thought about that. "You couldn't have known I'd be useful," she said. "No," he looked at her, "but I could tell you were serious. Serious people are useful. The form it takes you figure out later." "That's not very romantic," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." They sat with that for a moment, and then something happened that she hadn't entirely predicted. She laughed. Not a polite laugh or an uncomfortable one, but a real one, genuine and slightly surprised at itself. And after a beat, she heard him make a sound beside her that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd gotten from him, and it was real too, and the evening held them both in it, imperfect and honest and genuinely theirs. She said, "I was terrified." "I know," he said. "You couldn't have known. I didn't let it show." "You showed it," he said. "You were shaking. Your hands." He paused. "You didn't stop. That was the thing." She remembered standing in that square with the laughter coming at her from every side and her hands and the old boots and the weight of years of being the wrong size in the wrong place. And she remembered thinking, do it now or go home. She remembered that it hadn't felt like courage. It had felt like the only option left that she could live with. "I didn't have anything left to lose," she said. "That's what courage usually is," he said. "I don't think it's usually the other thing, the shining version." She looked at the valley. She thought about that. About what the shining version of courage looked like in stories versus what it felt like in practice, which was mostly like not having a better option and going forward anyway, scared and unprepared and making it up as you went. She thought about 8 families in Dunmore's cabin, and a stack of documents assembled on a table by lamplight, and 41 days of counting, and Garrick's face when she'd held up the letter from Commissioner Hatch. She thought about a barn in December and a woman in 2 small boots walking across a market square, and a question that had changed everything. Not because it was asked with bravery, but because it was asked at all. "Garrick," she said. "Yes. I'm glad I came across that square too." He looked at her. The valley was going to its darker gold now, the last of the direct sun pulling back above the ridgeline. She could see the hawk, or a hawk, maybe the same one, still working the thermals above the aspen grove in the far distance. Patient circles over the same ground. He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. Not dramatically. Just set it there, his rough, work-worn hand over hers, and left it. She turned her hand and held his, and they sat that way while the light went. And neither of them said anything else because nothing else was needed. The Territorial Court reviewed the syndicate's appeal the following spring, and denied it in most of its substance. 2 of the reversed claims were fully restored to their original holders. The third went to settlement, not ideal, but negotiated with Price's help at terms the original claimant found acceptable. Aldous Webb was removed from his position at the Land Office and the approval process was reformed in ways that made the specific manipulation Crane had been running significantly harder to replicate. Hollis Crane left the territory. Where he went, nobody seemed to know or particularly care. The Krellmore families formalized the communication network that Ilara had proposed to Dunmore on that August afternoon, a loose structure, not organized enough to be called an association, but real enough to function. Price became their capital contact on a modest retainer. They met twice a year and shared information about land office activity and territorial legislation and anything else that affected their claims. And Alara was the one who organized those meetings, which she did the way she did most things, practically, without ceremony, focused on what needed to happen rather than on the form of the thing. She was not comfortable being the person people looked to. She never entirely got comfortable with it, but comfort and effectiveness were not the same thing, and she had learned to operate in the gap between them. Garrick's side healed fully by the second winter. He moved without compensating for it anymore, which she noticed in the particular way she'd noticed the compensating. Not with announcement, just with an internal inventory update. A small relief that she kept to herself because he would have found the monitoring faintly irritating, and she couldn't entirely blame him. Their second winter together was different from the first. Not easier exactly. The mountain didn't get easier, it just became familiar, but inhabited differently by two people who had stopped moving carefully around each other and started simply moving. The way you move through a space that's yours. They argued and worked and ate together and were quiet together in the ways that they were each quiet, and it was imperfect in the specific, livable ways that things are imperfect when they're real. She mapped the rest of the valley that second spring. The full survey. North slopes, upper ridges, the eastern tributary system, all the way to where it emerged from the rock shelf she'd found the year before. She did it properly, with reference markers and accurate notation. And when it was finished, she had something that was better than her father's work, not because she was more skilled than Caleb Voss, she wasn't, but because she knew the land from having lived on it, which is a different kind of knowledge than technical training and, for certain purposes, more useful. She sent a copy to Price and kept the original in the tin box where the deed had always been. One evening that spring, she was sitting at the table with the finished map spread in front of her when Garrick came in from the barn. He stopped and looked at it over her shoulder. He looked at it for a long time. "It's complete," he said. "Yes. You've marked the spring behind the root cellar. It's a water source. It should be on the map." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Your father would have been proud of this." She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the map, at the lines her hand had drawn, the notations in her handwriting, the record of a piece of ground that had become, against all reasonable expectation, the most known place in her life. "I think he would have been proud of all of it," she said finally. "Not just the map." She meant the 40 acres she still owned in Black Ridge, which she'd leased to a farming family who worked it well and paid her quarterly. She meant the accounts that ran clean and the supplies that lasted through winter without running short. She meant the meeting at Dunmore's cabin and the petition and the letter from Commissioner Hatch. She meant Hector, who was old now and grey all the way through, but still ate well and gave her his specific mule patience when she handled him. She meant the cabin that was solid, and the roof that held, and the valley that was green in the mornings when she walked out and looked at it. She meant being here, still here, in a life that had been built from the wreckage of no other options by a woman who had done the only possible thing and kept doing it, one day at a time, without knowing if it would be enough until it was. Garrick put his hand on her shoulder. She reached up and put hers over it, the same gesture, mirrored from that evening on the porch, and they stayed like that for a moment over the map of their land. What the town of Black Ridge had believed about Alara Voss was that she was too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. That she was a problem the world would resolve by attrition, by wearing her down until she either diminished into something manageable or disappeared entirely. They had not factored in what happens when a person who has been told their whole life that they are too much finally arrives somewhere that can hold them. They had not factored in that the size of a person is not always visible, that the woman standing in that square in her dead mother's boots, shaking where no one could see it, had inside her something that Black Ridge had never had occasion to call on, and so had never learned to see. The world tends to judge people by their surfaces, by the easy, visible things, the shape of a body, the smallness of a waist, the correctness of an appearance. It rarely asks what someone can do when the situation becomes serious. It rarely discovers what someone is capable of in ordinary time, in the daily unmarked work of keeping a life together through things that have no drama and no audience. Alara Voss had been that kind of capable all along. She'd known it privately, the way you know the things about yourself that the world hasn't gotten around to confirming yet. And she had learned, the hard, long way, that waiting for the world to confirm you is not a strategy. That sometimes the only way to be seen is to go somewhere that has eyes for what you actually are. She had gone. She had arrived. She had built something real in difficult ground, with imperfect materials alongside a man who was not easy and a community that had not been cohesive and against a threat that had not been small. It wasn't a triumph in the storybook sense. It was a life, complicated and ongoing and genuinely hers. That was the thing no one in Black Ridge had ever been able to offer her, and it turned out to be the only thing that mattered.